Hello, and welcome to the Flights of Fancy podcast, the podcast where we talk about combat and military aviation, past, present, and future. As always, I'm your host, Mr. O, and with me is my guest, Mr. X.
Hey everyone.
Today, we're going to be talking about the Embraer company, the company that's the owner, producer, designer of the Tucano and subsequently the Super Tucano. Now, I've got a lot to talk about, so hopefully I can squeeze this into as small an episode as possible. So we'll just jump right into it. The Tucano itself was born out of a requirement and subsequently difficulty in acquiring spare parts for, at the time, the current training aircraft, the Cessna T-37C. There was a big snafu in the mid 60s, I believe, between Brazil and the United States, where there were issues on policy, and Brazil or members of Brazil and within Brazil decided that it would be a much better idea to just have their own um, domestic business in which to supply their own air force's needs and, if need be, produce vehicles or aircraft for the world at large. Now, um, the Embraer Tucano was obviously proposed by the Brazilian Embraer company, and this was seen as an excellent proposition, mainly because, well, the Embraer company could make an aircraft that was designed specifically for Brazil's Air Force, their needs, as well as Brazil being able to support an indigenous company. So, in all aspects of that exchange, it benefits Brazil entirely. Should things go well, the Embraer company could also make a name for itself in foreign orders, which could help solidify the not only the future of the company, but as well as just generating funds that they can reuse either within Brazil or to make more build a bigger footprint outside of their native country. Now, the Embraer company, or more specifically, the Embraer Sociedade Anônima, came into being in 1969. This was thanks to an investment from the Brazilian government, which was itself influenced by officers within the Força Aérea Brasileira and other visionaries outside of the armed forces. I hope I'm getting the pronunciation right. Now, the company set about developing and producing its own aircraft, starting with the EMB 110 Bandeirante, which would serve as a modern, robust aircraft in order to replace the Douglas DC 3s that they had on hand. Now, for a little bit of backstory, replacing the DC 3s was seen as a necessary step just due to the general infrastructure of Brazil's aviation sector. Brazil has obviously the Amazonian jungle that covers a large area of its surface area within the country, but also just the general infrastructure of the country itself does kind of lends to two different major aspects. One being a more developed area with airports that we would see as being modern or just normal this day and age, but also having a lot of airfields that are more or less just strips of grass or dirt tracks that are barely paved. And this obviously creates problems because you need an aircraft that can operate off of both without any sort of major issues. And the Bandeirante was seen as a perfect solution. It was cheap, it was strong, and it really helped to solidify an economical base for the Embraer company. I don't have any photos of that particular aircraft being built, but this kind of gives you an idea as to where Embraer would be building, namely within its own hangars in its own offices. Now, with a burgeoning company and the political complications mentioned before, it was in the late 70s. So the clashes were between the US and Brazilian governments. Um, Mainly, these were centered on issues of nuclear power. I believe there were tensions between how Brazil was to either refine or simply use nuclear power to obviously power its state. And the US wanted to regulate that in a way that's obviously imposing its own restrictions and limiting Brazil's own autonomy, as well as issues with regards to human rights abuses and political prosecutions. But I mean, that's I don't want to get too into it just because obviously this isn't really the podcast for that. Now, these complications led to the cancellation of any more help by the Cessna company in terms of spare parts for the roughly 65 T-37Cs that were purchased by Brazil. So as this door was closing, the FAB or FAB, which is the Brazilian Air Force, they attempted to purchase massive amounts of parts, but this couldn't be accomplished because they had budget restrictions. So by 1978, they would receive no further support, um, either because it couldn't be offered or it simply wasn't available from Cessna. And it should be commended to ground crews that they did as much as they could in order to keep those trainer aircraft in flying condition for over 2 years after that point, which is no small feat because trainers will typically take a lot more punishment because you're having to stress the aircraft more. There's a lot more hours they get put on it due to wanting to train more pilots and so on. Now, this issue, namely the lack of parts, not being able to be self-sustaining, essentially lit a fire within Embraer itself, who set their R&D departments in motion for a successor. Now, questions were raised and needed answers, obviously, such as what power plant would you use? How does that affect the potential focus for training pilots? As well, they did what they could to reuse parts designed for other aircraft in production within Embraer in order to minimize costs for the final design. Now, it should be noted that um, talking about what kind of plane to use becomes very important when in the 70s there was a marked increase in the cost of oil, specifically from 1970 to 1979. According to the book I have, uh, oil prices jumped from $3 US to $40 US. So it's a major consideration if you're building a jet aircraft, which typically will consume more fuel, as well as how closely they wanted the trainer aircraft to resemble the characteristics of aircraft that the trainees would eventually graduate to. Now, the result of all this would be a proposal aircraft, namely the EMB 301, internally is sometimes referred to as the EP 301 or 301 and 105. A more conventional design using a turboprop engine built as an advanced trainer that would be able to pull double duty. So not only would it be useful to train pilots, but it could perform some, I don't want to say basic tasks, but more rudimentary stuff like reconnaissance, liaison, observation, and to a limited degree, even ground attack missions. Now, it was emphasized that an aircraft such as that should have a low cost, not only to build but operate, and at the very least also be exportable to other potential buyers. It should be simple to maintain, capable of operating out of basic or short airfields, as well as maximizing visibility. In addition to a dual control system required for a trainer aircraft, of which it was built to resemble a fighter aircraft setup of the time, it was also planned to carry fuel tanks, free fall or fragmentation or incendiary bombs, have machine gun pods, or even rocket launcher pods, with varying sizes between 37 millimeters and 127 millimeter rockets. The initial design had four hard points, and so you would typically see a combination of those weapons on those hard points. Normally, how it's structured is you see the fuel tanks on the inner hard points if they're carrying them, and weapons on any of the four if they were desired. At the time, the EMB 301 was compared against 16 other designs, but they saw it more as a variant to the N-721A Karaja. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce that, but it was more of a variant than a proprietary design. So the company itself went back to the drawing board and tried to figure out something new or better. This resulted in another turboprop aircraft design that would have improved range and maneuverability, and also jumping from 4 to 6 hardpoints. The new design, called the EMB 311, as it would be designated internally as well, would be compared to the same 16 aircraft as the EMB 301, and was found to have a little bit more of a leg to stand on. Interest by the FAB, along with criticisms and reviews, led to the 301 being cancelled completely, and any necessary modifications being brought to the EMB 311. The modified design would turn into the EMB 312, and this was hastily set up for the FAB for evaluation. One of the major topics of discussion at the time was the ejection seats. These were seen to be a necessary addition for the aircraft, and the eventual decision would be to add Martin Baker Mark IV BR-04Bs. It should be stressed as well that the something that I don't think really comes up all that often, and this is a direct quote, is in terms of weight, it would be equivalent to the aircraft carrying 4 people, and the cost would represent 30% of the final price, $400,000 US. So your ejection seats are very costly and should always be considered when if you're designing your own aircraft or when you're trying to fund that sort of thing. As well, there's a contentious opinion which existed between the Air Force and Embraer itself over the cockpit configuration. Now, the FAB was used to having the instructor and trainee as sitting side by side. This seemed to be the style of the time. They operated with bigger aircraft, and there's one of the opinions as to why they thought that side by side would be better is that if the trainee pilot ever makes an error, the instructor can see that instantly and therefore correct any sort of negative attitudes or bad practices. Whereas in a tandem seat position where the trainee or instructor is in front and vice versa behind, the you don't get that immediate feedback. Now, Embraer itself did not want to budge. They were sure that the tandem setup, front behind, would be the better system, and ultimately, it was seen that Fab had to basically relent on it. As well, the ejection seats had to be specially designed, and we'll get into that a little bit later, just because of how everything would eventually operate. Now, it should also be stressed that even within Embraer, the decision on overall design was not so quick and dry. in the sense that even the designers would fight over how much of the aircraft was to be more modern versus simple, because you obviously have to look at it in two different ways, in the sense that you're looking at how much the aircraft will cost at the as an end result, but you also want to make sure that the aeronautics, the avionics that you're including in the aircraft are able to um, serve as good guidelines, or serve a good purpose and do well enough in order to allow a junior pilot to transition from, your basic propeller driven aircraft to, say, jet aircraft. And you also want to make sure that your aircraft, again, is competitive on a global market. If you make it too complex, if the aircraft is too expensive, then you're not able to compete versus aircraft designed in, maybe, I don't want to say more reputable, but in countries such as Belgium or Switzerland or Britain or Germany, you want to be able to export that at a reasonable cost, um, to make sure that you also get to secure your position in a global market. Now, in order to make itself more appealing to its competitors, it did a couple of very interesting things. The first of which being a one-button engine start. Now, I'm not entirely sure how it works, just because I can only understand so much of how different aircraft startup procedures work. I've read a couple from earlier aircraft, and there's a lot of checklist stuff to do. And it seems that the as a very innovative piece, a one button engine start was just very important. They also did another important thing, which was to merge the throttle and propeller pitch levers into a single unit. Um, it was initially not thought possible with the Pratt and Whitney Canada engine that they used, but Embraer themselves insisted to Pratt and Whitney Canada that they could modify it, or that it could be modified, so that they could merge both of those systems. Basically, this what it does is it eliminates the need for a pilot, whether they're trainee or not, to have to focus on both your throttle and propeller pitch settings. It's basically merged into one and will give you the best results at all times. Another very interesting feature about the Tucano itself would be that due to the inherent nature of torque, effectively the pull that an engine will have, because it's quote unquote biting into air, um, it obviously will pull to one direction or another depending on the propeller, the propeller is set up. And so to offset that, to make sure that you're not having to worry about your rudder control at all times, what they did is they actually offset the engine by 3 degrees along its longitudinal axis. So the engine is installed in a way that it offsets its own torque that would typically offset it, those few degrees. It is said that the change actually virtually eliminates all effects of torque on the aircraft, which, as a bonus, gives it a more jet-like feel when you're actually flying it, because you're eliminating that torque experience. Now, by 1979, the EMB 312 would eventually enter its final configuration for prototype design and testing. So we can kind of see the first configuration up top and how it would eventually end up. Obviously, there's a lot of changes to the angles of the nose, how the pilots are set up differently, how the cockpit looks. But it should be stated that the engine was changed from a 660 horsepower PT6A-27 to a more powerful 750 horsepower PT6A-25C. As it was discovered that the Swiss company Pilatus was making a their own trainer, which would use it was called the PC9, which would be outfitted with a 950 horsepower turboprop engine. In the book that I was reading, which is like the only source book I've found on the Tucano, it's alleged that the Swiss company actually stole the idea from Brazil, because something about having shown off the configuration at some point, or hearsay that the Embraer company was using a turboprop, and again, apparently the Swiss picked up on this and decided to go all out on their own as well. Um, we can also see in the difference between the first and final configuration just how much of a difference the cockpit takes. So um, normally in an aircraft, you will see it divided into several pieces. Obviously, there are exceptions to these. You have stuff like you might have, say, a P-51 in a bubble canopy. It'll still, or it should still have the front divider, but again, you'll you typically see that big difference between two. You'll have either a canopy that is seamless, or one which will have a frame in modern times. And sometimes they'll get bigger frames and so on. But glass technology has come a long way since, say, the 1940s. In any case, when having because they went to an entire cockpit being a single piece, you basically allowed the design to maximize visibility. There's no struts that'll get in your way. You don't necessarily have to worry about how the cockpit is split up in terms of framing, but it also gives its own problems. The biggest one, and probably the one of the only ones, was with the issue of ejection. So when you're ejecting, um, you have to take into consideration just how a seat will fly out, and where if any positions the glass needs to break, in the sense that, do you have det cord that runs the top? Do you have it? Um, do you just have something on top of the seat that breaks through? How does det cord, when it explodes, does that create shrapnel that could potentially hurt the pilot? Now, generally speaking, companies will do a lot of tests, so you can, because obviously you don't want to kill your own pilots while doing this sort of stuff. Um, but you can kind of get an idea as to if you're doing something, if you're ejecting, where exactly would you put that cord? How exactly do you separate it? Are they separate canopies? So, for example, the instructor could punch out safely by himself, and then the pilot could punch out later, or etc. Um, how they decided it and what they decided to do was actually rather innovative. It took them a lot of testing. They did testing over in Britain, along with some tests in Brazil itself. Um, but how they settled on was on these prongs. So we can see that there's some basically some giant pieces of metal that stick out from the back of the seat, and those pieces will actually pierce the canopy first, which prevents any sort of major shards or blockages from killing your pilot, basically. Um, the test that they conducted was essentially what would be the most ideal way. Um, Further on, we'll get into we'll be able to see the different setups that they went with eventually. But for the single piece canopy, that's how it would go. We can see here, just because of the nature of the testing, you don't really need to build an entire airframe. You're just testing how the glass is, how it's tempered. You're testing how it's going to break through, etc. So you don't really have to build an entire aircraft, just the basic model of the canopy. And we can see on the left the throttle. So instead of having two tracks that would guide your, if I remember correctly, your two tracks that would guide throttle and your propeller pitch, you only have one. This is basically the resting position, if I remember correctly. So great setup on both ends. Now, it should be stated that a project like this normally you're normally given about 2 years from acceptance of the design to flight trials. This is so that a company can fine tune the design itself. They can kind of stamp out any problems, iron out any potential wrinkles in the design, so on. But at Embraer, because they were under the knife, so to speak, they were given 6 months by the FAB and the government. Now, the first flight of the EMB 312, later named the Tucano, occurred on the 16th of August 1980, and the first official slash public flight taking place 3 days later. Um, Apparently, there's an actual bet going on as to if the aircraft would make it, would be able to fly before its official reveal. And there's a famous set of photos of one of the designers, Joseph Kovacs, who had bet his beard on it being the case or not. Now, one of the major tests for the aircraft was its capabilities during a spin, both in getting in and out of them. Spin test is a pretty regular test that you see done on aircraft. You want to be able to see how quickly an aircraft can get in, because it's obviously a dangerous position to be in, but also how quickly it can get out of a spin, because, well, if you can get out of it quickly, it means that if a spin occurs at lower altitudes, then you don't necessarily have to worry about it as much. There's more confidence in the plane being able to recover. Seeing as it's also a trainer aircraft and built on maneuverability, it lends itself to being able to do so. The Tucano actually went over 530 spin tests completed, and none of which, as far as I can tell, led to any faults, no loss of aircraft, no need for any sort of catastrophic issues, uh, no problems whatsoever, basically, which led Mr. Kovacs, one of the designers, to actually call the aircraft spin proof.
Whoa,
Yeah,
that's that's not actually a thing you want for a trainer plane because I mean, a trainer plane in particular, you want it to be able to recover easily. You want it to both for safety and just being able to operate in lower altitudes because this is moonlighting as a low altitude type of plane. The faster you recover from a spin, the better it is because it means you are less likely to enter a spin you can't get out of before you intersect with the ground.
right.
That's that's bad for airplanes.
Exactly.
But a trainer, you want it to be docile, but not too docile because otherwise there's less training value.
Hmm.
You know, there's a whole hierarchy of starting, intermediate, advanced trainers, and you need some degree of the ability to get into trouble to practice flying a plane that can get into trouble.
Right. And also being able to just get out of that trouble.
Yeah.
Um, it's said that at least one flight was conducted without the canopy in order to gather even more data on its performance. Another unusual test was that they'd fired 4-pound chickens at the canopy while it was on the ground in order to test its resistance. Um,
Oh yeah, that happens. There's videos of GE firing chickens into their high bypass jet engines because you want to be able to know whether or not it'll take a bird strike.
Yeah, I'm really sad that the program I use doesn't allow me to have video in it, because not that it exists, but I would love to be able to show 4 pound chickens being fired at canopies, just to see for my own curiosity how exactly those react. Um, but the success of those tests basically led the FAB or FAB to place an order for 118 aircraft. These aircraft would eventually be designated the T-27, although everybody knows them as either the Tucano or the EMB 312. Up here, we can see it's called the AT-27, basically the AT being for attack and trainer for the T. Um, as well as the 118 aircraft that were purchased, there was an option for an additional 50 airframes if they were to ever be seen as being needed. In the end, only 30 additional planes were ever requested. 15 of those were purchased by Brazil, but then sent off to Argentina. And Brazil eventually made another order of 15 to essentially, quote unquote, replace those that had gone to that prior country. Unfortunately, for a program like this, obviously not everything can go swimmingly well. One of the first setbacks for the project was actually the loss of the second prototype, as it exceeded speed limits and while doing so, applied rudder. The maneuver was violent enough that it actually tore off one of the wings as well as lifting off the canopy. The sudden change of wind is said, of wind speed, I should say, is said to have nearly decapitated both pilots. This event actually led Embraer to change the helmet design that they were using, so that they wouldn't encounter that problem anymore. I don't know what they had at the time. I believe it might have been U.S. design helmets, maybe another type, like maybe an indigenous type, but they swapped over to a French standard at the time to eliminate that sort of risk. Um, Tests were conducted both in Belgium and Brazil with ordnance in order to test out various equipment loads. These equipment loads would be all things, whether it's bombs, rockets, machine guns, etc. They tested not only the firing characteristics of all of these weapons, but also jettison trials, because you want to be able to, one, make sure that you can jettison your munitions if you have to, but also flight performance with the munitions on, with the munitions off, but with the rails on, and so on and so forth, and combinations thereof. In 1981, the that year would see the aircraft actually completing a tour through North America. Basically, their end goal was to get to the 34th International Aeronautics and Space Show being held in France. Typically, this runs, I want to say every 2 years. I always forget how many years in between every show, but basically it's a recurring show in France. And in order to generate buzz about the aircraft and try to market its capabilities, and just because how else are you going to get your aircraft to that show? They flew from obviously from Brazil. They went through South America into North America. They would then go east after hitting Canada into Greenland, fly all the way to Iceland, then the UK, and finally stop in France. Um, at the show, many different nations were actually given the opportunity to fly the aircraft. So, the way I understand it is that during these shows, you will typically have, obviously, you'll have representatives from the various military groups, you'll have representatives from the various companies to, one, scope out your competition, um, and two, just see like what are the trends going on around the world. When it comes to the 1980s, you don't necessarily have the same sort of distribution speeds of data as you do in 2020. So it was very important to have those sorts of personnel there, as well as having test pilots, whether they be military or civilian, or maybe more specifically contractors, at these shows so that they can get a good handle on potential purchases, or again, just seeing what other nations are coming up with in terms of design and output. Now, a second tour would be completed 2 years later when the aircraft were flying from Brazil. Generally, I want to say the same sort of route, going through Central and Northern America, east towards Denmark, and eventually south towards Egypt, and again further south to Kenya, and finally back to France. There's a lot of different stops between those major destinations. Um, but suffice to say that they went on a pretty wide ranging um, market of their aircraft. The tour was actually a really good way for pilots to familiarize themselves even more with their aircraft, and in more of a environmental sense, because obviously when you're flying from Brazil, you're going all the way up into Canada, Greenland, Iceland, so on. You're being able to test your aircraft at temperatures and in environmental conditions that you wouldn't necessarily see in Brazil. So whether it's snowstorms or blizzards in Canada, to your very cold either landscape or just altitudes above Greenland and Denmark and the UK, going down to the hot, arid climates of Egypt and further down in Kenya. The first military members to actually use the Tucano would be the Air Force Academy, otherwise known as the Academia da Força Aérea, and the Air Demonstration Squadron, or the Esquadro de Demonstração Aérea. I think that's how I got it. The latter of which is actually more popularly known as the Smoke Squadron, because of obviously the smoke that comes out of their aircraft. Um, an interesting side note is that the Smoke Squadron is actually the second oldest flight demonstration unit, just behind the Blue Angels in the United States. So the Smoke Squadron, working directly with Embraer, would be essentially the fathers of the program. They were the ones, as well as the Air Force Academy, of course, creating literature and designing how the training programs would go for every pilot after them. The reason for the choice was that the EDA would be the Smoke Squadron would be the demonstrators of the Tucano's capabilities, while the ADA, the Academy, would be the ones specifically training new pilots. Once enough pilots had been trained, the Smoke Squadron would then return to its initial focus of essentially demoing the Tucano, both in Brazil and abroad. The Smoke Squadron itself participated in numerous operations, or sorry, um, both the Academy and the Smoke Squadron performed in numerous operations, and those that would come afterwards in a lot of the different squadrons, performing reconnaissance and ground attack missions against guerrillas, both domestic and foreign. So not necessarily Smoke Squadron doing those because they're the demo squadron, but anyways, as well as just air-to-air duties against irregular or unknown flights, most likely to be drug dealers. If it's not known by you, the listener, there's a lot of illicit trade of drugs, obviously in Southern America, um, just due to the climate and cocaine fields and so on, and due to the nature of the landscape around there, you can somewhat easily create an airstrip in the middle of nowhere, and there's not much to really that really existed, certainly not back then, in order to catch these drug cartels. And so being able to have an aircraft that has a lot of endurance, flying at some decent speeds, and being able to communicate, obviously, back and forth to either air search groups and so on, you're able to minimize or, frankly, eliminate those sorts of illegal flights. Now, the Tucano itself is still in use in Brazil today, um, but there are plans that the Tucanos on hand are to be refitted or overhauled. The data I have on this is 2 years old by now, and allegedly the refits and overhauls are mainly for the landing gear and the engines. Um, if those are approved, because I'm not entirely sure if it's been approved yet. But if they're approved, the fleet of Tucanos should actually be able to last until 2032. And if they don't get those refits, they should last up until 2027. Which, considering an aircraft that came out in 1980, 47 years is actually not a bad lifespan for your aircraft. Now, just because I'm on this photo and I want to speak a little bit about it, the caption I have for this aircraft in the book I have labels this as one, it is armor plating. It's designed to essentially limit the impact of ground fire. This wouldn't hold up to anything larger than rifle fire or shrapnel, I guess. Um, and the caption labels this as being applied with double-sided tape. I'm gonna assume it's not the double-sided tape that we all know and potentially use, and more an industrial capacity one. But it's interesting to me just how it's cut and how it's formed. Um, if we go back, we can kind of approximate it to being about yonder, and obviously the armor would be on both sides. Now, the Tucano was actually used in a lot of different air forces. So, um, there I will be giving a list, but it's not too long. But anyways, we'll get to them. So of all the exported Tucanos, only two countries, only two first world, if you want to call them that, if you want to categorize countries that way, ever adopted them, which is actually pretty significant nonetheless. Those two countries being France and Great Britain. Now, France's Tucanos were more of a variant. They included a better life cycle potential and naturally French avionics, um, just due to the differences in language alone. Another important introduction was a ventral air brake. I'm not entirely sure why they ever wanted a ventral air brake, but the designers or the military members of the French Air Force decided that that would make a very suitable addition. The British version, however, would be built on by license via Short, which we've already talked about briefly in a previous episode, and that version actually featured numerous differences. We can kind of get a really good idea as to the differences on just in these two color plates. Um, so we can see that the exhaust is actually very different between these two aircraft, which kind of implies that there's a different engine, which there is. The structure for the canopy is completely revised. Uh, they decided that having the one strut was actually not that much of an issue and didn't impact visibility all that much. If your front pilot can't see something behind because of the strut, your instructor pilot can easily see what's behind there, and vice versa. Um, the major changes for the British version as well included, obviously, British avionics. They also wanted a ventral brake, the different engine as mentioned before, as well as the different cockpit layout, among some of the among the important changes, anyways. And these would all be implemented before the aircraft would ever be flight ready. So they had to make all these changes before it was ever built. Um, One thing I forgot to note was actually the rib at the rear of the tail. It was one of those features that they discovered while testing the aircraft, was that they would actually get a little bit more stability from it uh, by adding that little fin. So you can kind of see that it's missing on the first configuration versus the final one. Um, Now, it's important to note that some people might be wondering, why would Embraer decide to sell their design basically to Short so that they could build it on license? And from how I understand it, the reason being that the UK, much like other countries, doesn't necessarily want to have a foreign country sell their goods in Britain when they have their own aeronautics companies. So why they basically ask themselves, why would we not have say Short build us a new design that we would want? Um, in the States, you see the same thing with Cessna, and there's a couple other companies I'm forgetting about, um, and basically you get the gist. So
Cessna and other companies doing which?
I'm blanking on them right now, and it's bugging me.
That did what?
So for the United States to agree to say the Tucano, um, Embraer would have to basically uh, join or partner up with
Yeah,
U.S. company in order for them to even consider the design. Um,
yeah. I'm trying to remember. I don't remember which
yeah,
American companies
I
usually service cutouts for foreign designs off the top of my head either.
I think I have a couple more companies further in the script, so we'll surely get back to it with one of the other aircraft in this podcast. But regardless, point being that you, for protectionism reasons, the Embraer company had to go through Short, and more specifically, I shouldn't say that they had to go through Short. They weren't forced by the UK government, but Embraer chose Short. It's just a partnership that worked well for both companies, and typically how it would work would be you kind of shop your design, your business acumen to a bunch of different companies, and if one sticks or one works out for you, all the better. If not, well, you don't really have the ability to sell your aircraft as a design in that country. Um, the the pairing between Embraer and Short actually led to an impressive display at Farnborough in 1984, which would eventually seal the deal for the aircraft. As far as I understand it, the aircraft, the Tucano or Tucanos that were at that display, did so well that one of the representatives for the UK government basically agreed to it right then and there, and it was more of a matter of fact for signing the contract later on. Uh, Not only did the display go well, but there were obviously further trials and tests just to make sure that any changes still were within the specifications laid out by the UK government. They were very stringent on their requests. Getting an aircraft that can climb very well, that has a lot of speed, and that's why you see changes like the engine. But after all these trials, after all these tests, an order was placed to for 130 aircraft um, on the 21st of March, 1985. It should also be noted that due to the large number of differences between the two, uh, technically the Embraer Tucano and the Short Tucano should really be considered as two separate aircraft and not merely a variant, one being a variant of the other. Now, For the Tucano, both the original and the short version, um, the aircraft would actually see service with a number of nations. Brazil, obviously, France, and the UK have already been mentioned, but Angola, Argentina, the Central African Republic, Colombia, Egypt, Honduras, Iran, Iraq, Kenya, Kuwait, Mauritania, Paraguay, Peru, United States, asterisk on that one, and Venezuela all purchased Tucanos in some form or another. Now, some of these may have been more of expats of another country. So, for example, um, you might have, say, the Honduras Tucanos may have actually been expats of Colombia's Tucanos because they had served whatever purpose they had in Colombia and they sold it off to the next buyer. But regardless, there's still a vast number of countries that relied on the Tucano itself. It should also be mentioned that I believe Iraq specifically, it's kind of an asterisk in the sense that the U.S. was very much a part of that purchasing agreement, and tests were done to make sure that that sort of thing could be transferred to the Iraq Air Force, as well as the United States examples actually being civilian operators. The U.S. military never adopted the Tucano, and any Tucanos that you see in the U.S. are more specifically registered to private citizens or private contractors or private companies. So I believe there's two companies or one company that folded and sold it off to another one that essentially are um, I don't want to say Blackwater specifically, but the PMC groups. Um, when looking at uh, the Tucano, we can see the major differences between the Tucano, the original Tucano, and the short Tucano. Sadly, finding good photos on 3 image profiles is a little tough for the Tucano for some reason. It just seems strange as seeing as they're both recent aircraft, but we can see the major differences both in the engine. Somehow the short Tucano, just due to the engine, a couple differences, I believe, in the fuel allocation. You have to change the center of gravity, so they added a little bit on the wingspan. The length is different, so change that a little bit. Um, the increased engine obviously changes your empty weight. Um, Higher speeds allows you to carry a little bit more. One of the major differences with the short Tucano is that it actually didn't originally have wing pylons. The short Tucano was envisioned way more as just a trainer, whereas the Embraer Tucano was seen more as a multi-purpose aircraft. Now, obviously, this would change, not only because I have it in my notes, but because short Tucanos would eventually be sold to other nations, and they would require that hard points would be attached. It's also very interesting to see just how long these two aircraft can fly. Both of these stats are without drop tanks. So drop tanks, I don't know 100% how much more drop tanks would add, but it's certainly something to think about when you're examining these two, either against other trainers or against themselves. Here we can see a short Tucano. It's actually got its dive brake in action. Um, you can't really see it. It's kind of tough just because it's not really an undershot, but you there's no hard points and there's not even any evidence of weapons attached to this. So kind of gives you an idea as to how that changed. Uh, Also, the Tucano typically has some, or at least the early ones. Not sure how much they changed, but typically you would see Tucanos with probes that come out of the wings. There's at least one earlier photo that shows it. So difference when they were building the short Tucano. As well, it's a little tough to see. Hopefully I can circle around it. I'll just use red. Hopefully I can circle around it and give you a better idea. You can see that the explosive, there's some det cord here. So, or at least like explosive gel, or no, I'm pretty sure it's det cord. Anyways, you can see that it lines the entire canopy. So both canopies are lined separately, but they can both action obviously in tandem and what have you. But both of these are treated separately, and although they still retain the prongs, and the prongs are still good enough to actually punch through the canopy without any issues, as far as I read, they wanted the det cord just as an additional safety. Um, so yeah, that's why you see, if you ever want big differences between a regular Tucano and a short, those are some of the interesting points to think about or to look for, as well as the exhaust being in a different location. Speaking of variants, there is typically 5 different variants for the Tucano itself. The first being the EMB 312A, which is the original model. Sometimes it's given the A suffix, I believe, for attack, but I'm not entirely sure of the purpose. It's maybe more just to label it as the first one. The second model being the EMB 312F, which is the version that would go to the French Air Force. The third being the short Tucano version, otherwise known as the EMB 312. That's a bad three. 312S. And someday I will just use my draw pad instead. Um, there was a EMB 312G1, which is a variant developed by Embraer, which, funnily enough, was designed to use a Garand TPE 331-12B 1100 horsepower turboprop engine, which is the exact same that Short used. Now, that version was actually dropped. It would be canceled because Short was building a similarly powered aircraft, and since it uses the same airframe and has, while it has enough significant changes to be considered its own model, it's there's no reason to compete with yourself, basically. And lastly, there was the EMB 312H. This variant is sometimes called the helicopter killer. It was designed to effectively fly at a slightly slower speed, just to improve loitering times, I believe, and was designed so that it could carry air-to-air munitions, and was more of a fighter in the traditional sense in order to accomplish that helicopter killer designation. So, a couple other changes for the helicopter killer version would be that it was a single seat aircraft. It'd have increased fuel capacity, slightly different airframe dimensions to accommodate the change in the new engine, having more armor or improved armor, new weaponry, and some other more changes. The interesting part is that the helicopter killer variant actually would turn out to be the Super Tucano, the basically the progeny or son of the Tucano. And if anybody's ever curious as to how to perform a dead stick landing or to have instructions for a dead stick landing where you have no engine power, here's a nice little chart. I always like finding these things in aircraft manuals. Sadly, I can't actually find any original Tucano manuals. I don't know if they just never had any, or if they're not available in English. I just haven't been able to find any. So this is actually the glide procedures for a short Tucano. So here we see a Super Tucano, how things would change basically for well, between the original design of the Tucano to a much more modern version of the aircraft. So um, we'll see it a little bit in the diagram later on, but there's a lot to kind of point out and note. It's not readily available in the photo, but you can kind of see something sticking out of our of the wing. This was Embraer's decision to, instead of having machine gun pods, which it could still carry if needed, they would actually go with wing mounted machine guns. These would still be in the 50 cal versions that you could see in the machine gun pods that they were used. Um, but it's said that Embraer actually took inspiration, if not design cues, from World War II aircraft. I think the story goes that they went to the United States and actually looked up close on a P-47, and I think the other one is a Hellcat, but I'm forgetting offhand which what other reference aircraft they looked at. And essentially, what they did was look at um, how the gun was set up and how the ammunition was stored, because depending on the size of the machine gun, how you install it, where exactly you install the ammunition feed, and how it works impacts the overall design of the wing itself. You're having to figure out where this weight will be placed, and how it will affect, say, the main wing spars. Um, how do you design your fuel tanks around those sorts of things, and stuff like landing gear, where is that going to be positioned, and so on. So that was one of the major design changes. While the exhaust for the engine has returned to a more quote unquote normal position for the a regular Tucano, or a non-short Tucano, I guess. It's a different engine. We have an air scoop at the back. The cockpit now features two frames, or two framing points, so an even sturdier um, design. We can see that there's a different setup. So this is much more for actually using your machine guns. So there's more of an emphasis on actually firing weapons and using this as a weapons platform. And while it's not immediately noticeable on this photo, they went from four hardpoints to six, down to five. So the main hard point on the center line of the fuselage is actually that fifth one that wasn't normally there. We can also see that well, basically 20 years had gone between your Tucano, from it taking its first flight, to the Super Tucano, which would also take flight. Um, After 20 years, it become clear to Embraer that they would need to modernize once more if they wanted to compete. The Tucano was a great aircraft, and I think the amount of buyers for the aircraft, or users of the aircraft, kind of is a testament to that. Um, but you still have to keep reaching that lofty goal of financial stability. And so um, they had to modernize. They had to go back to the drawing board and see what they could do. Um, and this came at a point as well where the company was facing financial issues, um, just from borrowed money or money owed, and so on and so forth. Um, I don't know too much about it, just because I haven't seen much that really delves into the financial issues of the company. But regardless, uh, 20 years later, more there's more funding for, say, the U.S. In terms of their air force. The market is bigger for other nations to now invest, so to speak, in Embraer and its products. And so, because of that potential, um, and as well as the Tucanos, as mentioned prior, are we're also getting old in Brazil itself. You and Brazil was also starting to not necessarily openly stated, but they needed a replacement as well. And so all these different combinations of factors basically all came about at near about the same time. And so what Embraer did was they actually invited some pilots within the FAB, and discussions were held in private between those pilots, essentially the FAB, depending on how you want to really categorize it, and the company itself, in order to draw up what would eventually be the requirements for the aircraft. So while the Super Tucano actually holds a somewhat vague resemblance of the Tucano, the original one, there's actually a lot of changes that would happen um, externally, just from the changes in structure, airframe performance, and so on, but also drastic changes on the inside. Um, I think if these changes aren't immediately noticeable, just in how everything looks. The all the additional bobs and bits and bobs you can see on the aircraft. The internals as well were a major change. Um, Earlier in these slides, uh, hopefully I won't spoil too much from other stuff, but all of this was mechanical dials. All of these are simplistic, yes, helps to lower your cost, but they don't necessarily reflect the the now modern displays that you would see in various fighter aircraft. And so the one of the major points of the redesign to go from Tucano to Super Tucano would be the addition of all of these displays. It also helped that adding all of these displays and all the functionality that they bring um, modernizes your aircraft to a point where you're capable of actually using this as a fighter aircraft, because now you have the ability to, or you have more of an ability to use missiles in whatever capacity they may be. So the cockpit, as mentioned, drastically changes to have a more modern layout. It's got digital displays now. It's got new and more avionics. Um, the control stick uh, will control your machine guns, obviously, but you now have machine guns internally in the wings. You have different. You have an entirely different hardpoint slash pylon arrangement. So while they now have five instead of the six seen prior, or the four seen prior, depending on which vision you're talking about, it's also just set up differently. There's a new engine for the aircraft, and so on and so forth. Now, all of this modernization, all this effort put into it, actually caused some friction within the FAB. So, because what ended up happening is that you have a lot of pilots in the Brazilian Air Force that didn't actually have experience with these new systems. It's kind of a catch-22 of we need to modernize, but now we're more modern than whatever the standard is in our home country. And so, in a sort of reactionary view, they didn't really trust these new systems. Um, but despite that, they were actually able to, just through I don't want to say marketing, but uh, training, doing testing, inviting representatives of the FAB to see the aircraft, have the aircraft demoed, and so on, would eventually convince any of the old guard, I guess we'll call them, and convince them to that the modernization for the Tucano was actually a necessary change. Um, as mentioned previously, a lot of the changes, some of those would also include the greater number of weapons that the vehicle could carry. So before the Tucano could carry around 2,000 pounds, I think it was. The new arrangement actually allowed it to carry 3,500 pounds. Um, it could now have radar, which is obviously way more important if you're, say, tracking down drug smugglers in illegal flights in and out of the Amazonian jungle, um, and just having better armor protection, being able to perform missions at night with a more comprehensive night vision goggle setup, and so on and so forth. Um, we can kind of see a really good view of the two aircraft side by side. So while the general profile of the nose kind of remains the same, you are looking at a different propeller arrangement. The Tucano has fewer propellers, I believe, than the Super Tucano. Um, we can see that the armor package is actually built up slightly differently. So instead of being one like elongated piece, the armor package is now bolted on in two separate pieces. This is usually done actually to allow it. I don't want to say more modability, but if only your front piece is damaged for whatever reason, you don't have to replace both. So it's cheaper to have them in separate pieces. You'd obviously run the risk of maybe something happens directly in the middle, but I mean the risk isn't that great. So usually, usually that's sort of already calculated and afforded in its design. Um, it's easier to see on this one, but the Tucano always had a what they call a luggage compartment. Obviously, your pilots, especially if they're doing few transitions from one base to another or whatever, you kind of need something to bring your gear with. And it's kind of slightly painted over. I believe it's this panel here. This is large enough. Um, but suffice to say that the Super Tucano had a lot of changes to it, and this would obviously see it having an equal, if not greater, amount of support or purchases in countries outside of Brazil itself. The Super Tucano essentially it continues that legacy of the Tucano itself, being a very good trainer aircraft if need be, but also a light attack aircraft um, if desired. The hard points give it a lot of variability. It's able to perform over long stretches of in long stretches of land or water or whatever you want. We can see the increase in range is pretty crazy, almost double, um, while having an increase in max speed and everything else that's really afforded to it. Um, to give it a little bit of perspective, I guess a couple other details are that the Super Tucano is actually was actually purchased, um, and as far as my the book I have, it's two separate books, sadly, on the Tucano and Super Tucano. But regardless, the Super Tucano is either in use or will be in use in the following countries. You have Afghanistan, Angola, Brazil, obviously, Burkina Faso, Chile, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Ghana, Honduras, Indonesia, Lebanon, the Republic of Mali, Mauritania, Nigeria, Philippines, Turkmenistan, and finally the United States. Now, the United States, I believe, gets another asterisk because it's not necessarily the U.S. Army. They're still, if I recall correctly, the last I've ever heard is that the U.S. is still going through trials to potentially get the Super Tucano, but nothing's been solidified or put into print yet. Um,
And I
one
think
of
they've also been considering other stuff like the OV10 Bronco and stuff,
yes, yeah,
trotting out all sorts of things to potentially fit that niche.
the Bronco is probably the main competitor I want to say for that competition. But uh, to give it a little bit of perspective, um, the Super Tucano is a fairly small package. It can it can have one pilot if need be. It can have both if desired. Um, you can have a wide array of weapons on it, from air-to-air missiles to air-to-ground missiles, from bombs to machine gun pods, and so on and so forth. But one maybe way more important thing should be looked at, namely the fact that the Super Tucano is, um, I don't want to say estimated because it's not really an estimate, but the Super Tucano costs about $1,000 US to operate per hour. The latest figures I can find on the F-35, which would be obviously they're two different aircraft, but if you ever use an F-35 in a ground attack scenario, or say an A-10 in the same sort of situation, the F-35 costs $40,000 per hour. You can kind of see how the Super Tucano might be a more desirable choice when you start putting a price tag on it. Now, I guess it's a little irrelevant to talk about just because the U.S. is, one of the richest countries in a way in the entire world and so on. But it stands to reason that um, being able to piss away that much money per hour isn't necessarily a good thing.
Yeah.
If people want to talk about cutting budgets and whatnot, which is obviously a discussion for another time, you can start at least in certain locations. Um,
Yeah, though there is potentially the counter argument that you're taking up the time of, you know, one American pilot, one American co-pilot, an American ground crew, which is all Native American service members that cost a pretty decent amount of money to, hire, keep fed, provide for eternity. And they're providing air support for people who are again expensive to upkeep. So who knows?
yeah,
That's one of those things where the economics can indicate towards using a more expensive, more capable thing
yeah.
potentially.
So yeah, I mean, certainly valid points of um, when costing out things. Uh, this is just another image I wanted to put in just because we can see the differences just in options that some countries will go either with how they want to fly their aircraft, whether it's loaded with the different kinds of munitions, them being like fuel tanks. We can see a ventral fuel tank here, and there's two fuel tanks, so you can kind of see the positioning that the ventral hardpoint has to take. Rocket pods, we can see a good photo or good example of just how far and where they're positioned, the machine guns that is, and again how the structure is framed, the difference between uh, the armor being on versus it not being on. It's not actually a requirement, so it's one of those modular pieces that's actually pretty helpful to have. I'm not quite sure why the Mauritanian Super Tucano is missing this rear. I don't want to call it an aerial, but I forget what the piece is. Um, 97. It's a good thing I have this design here. The VHF antenna. So I'm not sure why it's missing that antenna. Maybe it's just drawn as pictured type of thing. I'm actually gonna take like 2 seconds. I want to find I want to find that company that we're talking about because it's going to kill me if I don't find it again. Um, but yeah, other than finding this one last piece of trivia, that was our podcast on the Embraer Tucano and Super Tucano. Um, as always, thanks, Mr. X, for being with me. It was a lonely podcast the last time out.
Oh
Um,
no.
um, the Tucano, because it's relatively recent, at least the Super Tucano, there's only so much data that's actually out on it. So I kind of feel a little strange covering a currently used aircraft because, in a way, the entire story of the Super Tucano has not yet been told.
Yep. The
So
history isn't done yet.
yes, exactly. So you kind of there may be a couple things that will change, and maybe we'll have to set up a further episode 10 years down the line if we ever make it that far that talks a little bit more about the Super Tucano. Um, I can only really mention the both books by I'm not even gonna try and pronounce his name because it will be butchered. The both books are by Harpia Publishing. they're essentially the only two sources on the Tucano. Obviously, the EMB 312 book is centered entirely on the Tucano. The Super Tucano book is actually probably about a third the size of the Tucano one. So if you're very interested, if you're interested in any way, shape, or form, really about the history of the Tucano, I cannot advertise the EMB 312 book enough. It's a very solid reference. It's very interesting reading up on all the different uses that the aircraft has. And while people are looking at the various links and such, we'll hopefully find the company stuff that I'm looking for. Embraer began talks with McDonnell Douglas for a partnership if its project was
Oh
to
yeah.
be the winner. Negotiations were discontinued in 1990 July, and in January, the talked to General Dynamics. So they talked to General Dynamics. Um, there's a little bit of doubt as to uh, the Cessna T-41 because of its use as an elementary trainer. Um, these are assuaged following the decision of McDonnell Douglas. General Dynamics also gave up on the partnership, and ultimately Embraer partnered with Northrop. So Embraer goes from with three different companies to try and get its products sold in the U.S. So as mentioned with the short, I don't want to say issue, but the development of the short Tucano, the U.S. uses the same sort of system where it must be an indigenous company that produces that aircraft within the United States. Otherwise, they don't even consider it. Um, they divided by saying that Embraer would develop the tooling, the fabrication of the entire metal structure, the subassemblies, transportation, and testing of any special equipment, whereas Northrop would undertake the assembly line, test flights, and actual delivery of the aircraft. There's a couple more details. Talks about how the aircraft was superior to the Pilatus PC-9, how it's competitive for the JPATS program, in May 1992, a protocol of intent was signed with Northrop, so that's where they're actually like finalizing that they are partnering with Northrop if everything goes well. Um, there were 100 hours of demonstrations in 83 flights, and then it says with the results obtained, two more prototypes were built, incorporated with the requirements, modifications. Tests were done with the United States Air Force and the United States Navy. 82 landings. Hmm. Um, in June 1995, Pilatus, in partnership with Beechcraft, won the competition to provide 372 T-6A Texan 2s to the USAF and 339 to the USN, with a total value of estimated at $4 billion. The costs during the fleet's life cycle were expected to reach another $7 billion. So, kind of gives you an idea as to how much these programs actually cost and just how much the U.S. invests in purchasing even simple trainer aircraft. Um, there was also a uh, flying training in Canada, which was actually looking into um, getting their own Super Tucanos. Royal Canadian Air Force, in partnership with the Defense Systems Division led by Bombardier, and a consortium signed by CAE Aviation, ATCO Frontec, British Aerospace Military Aircraft, and Embraer. The Super Tucano would be employed for the basic training, which would eventually qualify military pilots for their future aviation roles, whether it be air combat, helicopter, or transport. Following the announcement of the winners, which also included the BAE Hawk for the advanced training flights on the jet pilot course, the Super Tucano and Hawk flew together for an advertisement photograph. However, as a protest, Bombardier, Embraer's main rival in the segment of regional transport aircraft, refused to buy Embraer's Super Tucano in favor of Beechcraft's T6 Texan 2. And that's why there are no Super Tucanos in Canada.
That's a shame, I guess.
I should
I
also
don't know
ask,
whether I'd be mocking Canadian procurement for ending up with Tucanos.
you know what? Tucanos are you could mock Canadian.
I can mock
You,
Canadian procurement for
yeah,
everything except their
yes.
small arms, which are inexplicably correct choices. It's weird.
I hope you all enjoyed our episode. I'm not entirely sure what will be up next time, but stay tuned. It'll be something interesting, I guarantee it. Thanks for watching.